Ms. Kelley, welcome to the briefing. It's all you. You can do it from here, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here and for your interest in this subject. We've just put out, UNHCR has just put out our Global Trends report, which shows, again, very depressing and persistent high levels of forced displacement, with over 65.6 million people in 2016 having been forced to flee their homes due to persecution, conflict, and violence. Of that number, 40 million persons, over 40 million, have been displaced within their own countries. And then there are 24 million refugees, including 5.5 million Palestinian refugees who come under the mandate of Unhcr. And while the rate of increase is somewhat less than the previous year, it remains true that this is a very depressing and high level of forced displacement. And when you look at it, it's in its historical context, it's also quite disturbing. We're used to looking at the world and seeing progress, but there is no progress to be made in terms of conflict violence that is producing people who've had to flee. Over the last 2 decades, the numbers of, for example, of people who've been forcibly displaced have doubled, and the greatest rate of increase was between 2012 and 2015, largely due to the Syria crisis. Sadly, that's not the only crisis, however, that's produced this increasing trend. We also see conflict in Iraq, in Yemen, South Sudan, Central Africa Republic, Burundi, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Sudan, to name a few, which also has contributed to this increasing level of forced displacement. And I always say when we're looking at numbers, they can be kind of numbing. And surely when you look at the Global Trends report, it's overwhelming in the amount of detail there. But each individual number really reflects a deep level of human loss and trouble that is experienced every minute and every second of every day, where 20 people are displaced every minute and 3 people are forcibly displaced from their home every single second. If they were a country, they would constitute the 20th most populated country in the world, larger than the United Kingdom. And another very disturbing statistic in the global trend is the impact on children. Children globally constitute just over 30% of the population, yet in the refugee context, they make up over 51% of the refugee population. If you look at South Sudan, which is the largest growing refugee crisis in the world today, which had over 1.4 million displaced as of the end of 2016, 66% of those refugees who are fleeing are children. And I can tell you it's very difficult to manage the influx that's happening right now of refugees as a result of the South Sudanese crisis. Large numbers of women, very young children, infants, pregnant women. It makes the humanitarian response much more complex. And if we look at the asylum figures, there were almost 2.8 million asylum applications last year. And of that number, we know that there were 75,000 children who arrived and made an asylum application unaccompanied or separated from their families. And I really ask you to pause and think about your own children or your nieces or your nephews, and then think about the journeys that refugees take across conflict areas, across deserts, climbing mountains, giving their lives to unscrupulous traffickers and smugglers, and imagine those journeys by children without their parents or without adult accompaniment. Then they arrive and they are alone. So that's another very disturbing trend, and it's also, we know it's underrepresented, the number, because there's some countries that don't record unaccompanied children or separated children in that category. Sadly as well, the realizations of solutions is still slim. Although there were 6.5 million internally displaced persons who did return home and over 500,000 refugees who returned home, many of them returned to situations of ongoing instability where the peace agreements were tenuous, where their properties were either confiscated, destroyed, or inhabited by others, where social service provision was slim. And so the sustainability of those returns remains in doubt, and which is why we continue to press for greater peace and reconciliation efforts and for more development assistance to help sustain returns so that these solutions will be realized in the longer term for those who were able to seize them. The resettlement statistics are slightly more positive in 2016 than 2015, where 189,000 refugees found homes somewhere else in a third country, up from 160,000 the year before. This is very positive news for those individuals, but of course it still represents a minor number in terms of overall refugee flows and far less than those who need to be resettled. The largest displacements continue to be borne by developing countries. 84% of all refugees are housed and provided security and safety in developing countries, and 1/3 are in the least developed countries. And to bring that home to you, if you look at Chad rates, I think it's 186 on the ranking out of 188 countries on the Human Development Index. And Chad is the largest country in the world, proportion to its population hosting refugees. So Chad is extremely stressed as it tries to provide for its own population as well as for refugees. Uganda is also another searing example. Uganda in the last several months has taken in, on average, 1,500 to 2,000 South Sudanese refugees every day. Uganda now is the largest refugee host country in all of Africa, hosting over 1 million refugees. It's also very stretched in terms of its ability to help its own population, and yet there it is at the front lines, welcoming refugees, allowing them access to its limited social services, to employment, providing land for them. And yet Uganda is very rarely in the news today, and yet it's doing this enormous gesture at great cost to itself. Middle-income countries are also very much burdened by the refugee flows. If you take Lebanon, for example, Lebanon would fit quite nicely into the state of Connecticut. And Lebanon has the third largest population of refugees. It has over 1 million refugees. 1 in 6 people in Lebanon are refugees. It's a country who suffers from very weak social service systems of an infrastructure that is quite fragile and needs much more support, which really brings us to where we need to go in the future. Obviously, there needs to be much more effort and successful effort at conflict mitigation and peace and reconciliation. Without that, I think we can expect these numbers to continue to increase. But we also need new approaches to respond to refugee outflows and to respond to displacement generally. And in that, the New York Declaration last year that was signed on by all member states of the General Assembly points in some positive directions that need to be seized. Specifically, I'd point to the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework in the Annex, which we are now implementing in several areas around the world, which call for a very comprehensive approach to supporting refugees, but also the communities in which they live, so that we can deliver real benefits, real life-sustaining changes to refugees, but also the host communities among which they've lived who are also very much impacted by a refugee population and also experience severe levels of poverty as a result. And finally, I would say that we talk in terms of systems, but it's also true. People often come up to me and say, what can I do? These numbers are overwhelming. Well, we ask people not to turn off. We've got a message of every donation counts, every bit of advocacy matters, try to build bridges between communities, talk to communities who may not understand the refugee dilemma, who may never have met a refugee, and make links between refugees and people who might be fearful of them. Do whatever we can to create an environment that is more humane and tolerant and recognizes that refugees have been displaced due to consequences beyond their control, but have great contributions to be made as well.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Kelley, on behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, thank you for this briefing. My name is Sherwin Bryce-Pease, South African Broadcasting. I mean, the figure 84% being hosted in low or middle income countries. I mean, that is clearly an imbalanced number. What sort of responsibility do rich countries, does the developed world have, particularly in the environment in which people are talking about building walls and keeping refugees out?
Well, I think the responsibility is the one that they embraced last September. Now we have to put it into action. If you look at the New York Declaration, it's a wonderful document full of bold commitments that we have to do more. There has to be more responsibility sharing. There has to be more sharing of burdens. We have to ensure that there is humanitarian assistance is provided in a predictable manner. We have to really support states who are carrying a disproportionate load, and they've signed on to this global refugee response framework. And I think it will be very important for us all to follow that in the year ahead. We're implementing it now throughout Africa. We also have it's starting up in Central America, and these are bringing a constellation of different stakeholders together, improve governments, donors, humanitarians, development actors, private sector, to say, okay, we need a much more sustained support to these communities that are supporting refugees. Let's now see and if that comes to fruit, and we're putting all our energy and efforts into making it happen. That's where the answer lies in terms of, short of solving the political conflicts that create these problems.
Yeah, you mentioned, of course, 4.8 million Palestinians. Nizar Abu Dab al-Mayadeen television in Lebanon. You mentioned the plight of the Palestinians, 4.8 refugees since 1948 until now. And there is no progress on that. Not only that, the number is increasing with the expulsion of people, with the demolition of houses. Who you put the blame on that in this respect? Why this crisis has not been able to be resolved in any manner?
Well, that's a question that's far beyond my pay grade, I have to tell you. When you look at the longevity of the Palestinian crisis, and as you know, Palestinians fall within the mandate of UNRWA, which I don't represent UNRWA, I represent UNHCR. Our Global Trends report documents the number, which is over 5 million. But in terms of what is needed to solve the Palestinian situation, that's not what I'm here today to discuss, but clearly, like all refugee situations, including the Afghan situation that we have Afghan refugees that have been displaced for over 30 years. We've got Somali refugees who've been displaced for over 25 years. These are generations upon generations of displacement, and clearly a political solution is necessary in order to address those causes, and I think most people recognize that. But in terms of how you get to that political solution, really that's not within UNHCR's mandate to be able to forge.
Recently, I may follow up on that, in Arsal in Lebanon, there were repatriation of Syrians. Especially in Arsal, there is a conflict, and the area is dangerous because of the presence of Daesh and the presence of Nusra and other terrorist groups. And some decided to return to Syria, which has become safer, a lot safer, especially the areas. Why the United Nations took a position which is against that, or they do not support such a return?
I cannot speak specifically to the current situation in Arsal. My direct experience of Arsal is when I was in Lebanon in 2015, and you're right, it's an area where the population in Arsal almost tripled, I think, as a result of the Syria crisis. But in terms of return home generally, what UNHCR advocates is voluntary return in safety and in dignity when conditions enable a sustainable return to take place. We don't prevent people from returning, but we don't facilitate return unless we're sure that it's voluntary and that it can be sustainable over the longer term.
So did you establish that it's the same subject?
Following up, I'm Sylviane Zehil from L'Orient Le Jour. Beirut. And I'm just following up about on Nizar's question. Actually, in Lebanon, there are more than 400,000 stateless little boy or girl born in Lebanon during the war since 2011 till now. There are stateless. Nothing has been done for them, and the country does not recognize them. What the United Nations does in this regard? And the second thing, Lebanon is need much more effort. What kind of effort do you suggest?
In regard to the Syrian refugee population, I can't give you the precise figures in terms of children that have been born in Lebanon since the crisis started. Those we can get for you. But indeed, there has been difficulty in terms of registering children's birth when they're born in Lebanon. It doesn't mean they're stateless. It means that many do not have the requisite document to attest to their nationality moving forward in the future. What's interesting about Lebanon is they do have a law which requires births to be registered. But it's a rather complex process, which is difficult for refugees to access. So we've been working very closely with the government to lower the practical impediments for birth registration, and that dialogue is ongoing.
Matthew, then 15, then Ross.
Sure. I wanted to, in reading through the report, jumped out to me the numbers that it has on Burundi. It seemed to say that the number of refugees went up by 39%, and that the IDPs quadrupled to 41,000. So I guess what I'm wondering is during this same period of time, the UN Secretariat has shifted envoys from what was considered a full-time envoy to a part-time envoy. The Security Council mandated police were never deployed. I understand you speak for UNHCR, but as UNHCR, is based on these numbers, would you say that the situation in Burundi has gotten better over the last year, and should the Secretariat be pushing harder or less hard to try to get to the root of this displacement?
I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. When you have a 40% increase in displacement, that speaks to a situation that continues to need to be addressed. So we're continue to be very concerned about the situation in Burundi. And in fact, we've offered Tanzania as one of the countries that has come forward to be a country for the implementation of the comprehensive refugee response framework, because it too is seeing the effects of the Burundian situation. But we continue to be concerned, and we're working to provide assistance, of course, to Burundian refugees. But as long as you've got that level of increased displacement, yes, that speaks to situations which continue to need to be addressed at their core.
Okay, just one directly on that. You have a section of the report where you talk about people that don't fall directly into your category, into the categorization, but are of concern. You say that there's 162,000 naturalized former Burundian refugees in Tanzania that are considered to be of concern by UNHCR. In what way are they of concern? And if they are of concern, how is this new Tanzanian offer not itself of some concern? Why are they of concern? I mean, what is the basis of the statement in the report that they are of concern?
I would prefer to get back to you with more precise answers from our colleagues in Africa who are dealing with that issue, because I don't want to misspeak on that precise point. But I do have Ron Redmond here, who's our Global Hub Desk, and he'll be happy to chase that down for you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Ahmed Fatih, American Television News. You said that there is 2.8 million asylum seekers, out of which 189,000 they were processed. Is this number a carry-on from previous years, or this is just for the year which is in report, which I believe for 2016? And the other part is what would be the fate of these, the rest of the 2.8 million people who have not been granted asylum?
Well, I can't speak to you directly. I have to go back to check the numbers. I know, for example, that Germany at the end of 2016 had over 700,000 asylum applicants, and the U.S. had over 250,000 persons who had claimed asylum. I don't know what the processing length is in either of those two countries, but what that measures is people who have come from countries where they're not recognized initially as necessarily as refugees. They have to go through the process to determine whether or not they meet the definition for as persons who are in need of international protection under the refugee definition. And for those that are found not to be in need of international protection, then those people, the states who have asylum systems, work towards ensuring that they are able to return home.
Thank you. Rosalind Jordan with Unhcr English. Two quick questions. One, does UNHCR have the financial resources that it needs to help the people who have been displaced either internally or forced to go to another country? And separately, the country with the second largest number of displaced people is Colombia. Could you please talk more about the situation in Colombia and what UNHCR is doing to help people return home? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. On our budgets, UNHCR budgets, like all humanitarian agencies, are not fully funded. In fact, often we rely on voluntary contributions. There are pledges made every November, and as of this time, and this is characteristic of many of our many years in the past, our budgets aren't nearly even a quarter met, which makes it very hard for us to meet the needs of refugees. We've recently put out a global report. I'd encourage you to look at that, because the global report tells you how much funding we got based on what we needed, and specifically what we were able to do with that funding per operation, but also tellingly what we couldn't do and what were the consequences of that funding not being met. So to give you a very practical example, we need to prepare for winter in countries that are affected by winter. We need to buy the materials. We need to get things in place. We need to start now. And often our budgets simply aren't able to allow us to do it. Our cash programs, which provide money to the most vulnerable families, allowing them to access health services, education, often they have to be cut short or diminished, or the net of coverage even becomes more smaller as the year progresses and numbers rise because our funding doesn't keep pace. But certainly in terms of our current funding, we can get you those numbers and the impact of them. And then in regard to Colombia, I mean, Colombia has the second largest population of displaced persons in the world, over 7 million. And in terms of the details of our program, I'd prefer to be able to provide you with a readout of that rather than speak off the top of my head and miss something that might be essential in our programs. But we can get you that today.
Thank you, Stefan. George Baumgarten, correspondent for Jewish newspapers in North America, as well as some East African and Pan-African publications. First, kind of a housekeeping question. You mentioned the Palestinian refugees over whom you do not have any authority. I assume, therefore, that anyone who is not a registered Palestinian refugee is subject to the authority of UNHCR. And secondly, more importantly, and I came in late, forgive me, you may have mentioned this, what happened to this colossal world's largest refugee camp somewhere in northern Kenya, which the Kenyan government wanted to close and move all of its refugees elsewhere? Is that closed? Is it in the process of being closed? Is it about to be closed? Or is it being kept for a while? Or what is its current status? Thank you.
In regard to Palestinians who fall within UNHCR's remit, I'll have to give you the exact numbers of them and where they're located, but it really depends on where they are. And in Egypt, for example, we have a community of Palestinian refugees that we're providing assistance and protection to. Interesting question about Kenya. Kenya, recently, last month, there was a Nairobi declaration where countries in the region pledged to, among other things, among their political and security pledges that they made, to have more joined up efforts in regard to improving asylum conditions within the country, helping to provide for sustainable returns within Somalia. It's a really very, very interesting document, and again, the progress on that will come forward in the comprehensive refugee response plan that we have that engages Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, and Ethiopia. And positively, there is a bill. There hasn't been the pressure on the returns has somewhat diminished in terms of people returning to Somalia. Of course, the famine there has been a disincentive to go back, naturally so, given the amount of people that are being displaced due to conflict and famine within Somalia. But more positively, and it was in Stefan's outlines this morning, is a new legislative law within Kenya that would provide for access to employment and land and other rights recognized to refugees, which is another very positive development in the region. In some sense, countries like Uganda and Kenya really provide a useful model for the world in terms of what can be done and what should be done for refugees in order to benefit from refugees' capacities, but as well provide support to communities in which they live.
Thank you, Steph. You mentioned the lack of a fair, in other words, you've mentioned that many countries are not taking in the number of refugees that perhaps you would expect given their populations, et cetera, and so there's not an even sharing of the burden. So you've mentioned Lebanon, Uganda, various countries that are opening their doors. But what about countries in other parts of the world, whether it be China, India, Latin America? Have they offered or have they set numbers that they would accept in terms of refugees? And also, I was wondering, is there a list of all the countries, what their policy is in terms of how many refugees they might consider, and also then how many refugees have approached these countries?
Well, the answer is in two parts. One is the countries that are adjacent to conflict, or the ones that receive the influx initially, and those are the ones that are disproportionately impacted by refugees. If you look at the Syria crisis, for example, where are the refugees? Well, the vast majority are in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So they're the first ports of call. But we are encouraging countries who are further afield to provide more predictable places for third country resettlement. And that's the number that is always disappointingly small, and which we continue to advocate be raised over time. We did have a number of new countries. I think we had 5 new resettlement countries last year. I think it went. I can't remember the exact numbers. They're in the global report. I think we closed with 37 countries around the world providing an option for refugees to go and live there. And we do have lists of those countries that do provide them, but we continue to advocate for more resettlement places, more opportunities for family reunification, more education scholarships, more even work exchange programs, things like that to broaden the possibilities for refugees to find solutions beyond their initial port of call.
Yeah, in the case of Yemen, of course, this is one of the biggest humanitarian crises. The only country which is adjacent to them is Saudi Arabia. How many refugees did Saudi Arabia take from Yemen? And if they have any other alternative to go to?
The situation in Yemen is absolutely devastating, you're correct. And I am not familiar with how many have sought asylum in Saudi Arabia, nor how many have been resettled elsewhere. That's a question we'd have to come back to you after this.
Is it safe for any Yemeni to head towards Saudi Arabia?
I really couldn't answer that. I just don't have the on-the-ground experience in Yemen, and I don't have access to that information sitting here, but it's something that we can come back to you on.
Ned, thank you so much.